Hello, this is Rahul Bardwaj, CEO of the Institute of Corporate Directors. Welcome and thank you for watching, and thank you for submitting your questions. As Canada and the world grapple with the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, the IPD is producing a series of webinars that focus on critical areas of governance that will help directors navigate the challenges in the weeks and months ahead. Today, we turn our attention to the difficulties that boards are facing in determining how to compensate their management teams when the vast majority of companies won't come close to meeting their earnings targets or their firm's objectives. So how do you treat people and stakeholders fairly? How do you recognize the effort management is making to keep the company afloat? Today, I'm joined by three experts who will walk us through the challenges that boards and compensation committees will be facing in the coming months. Carol Stevenson is a director of General Motors Company, where she chairs the Compensation Committee. Carol is also a director of Intact Financial Services and Maple Leaf Foods. She's a former dean of the Ivey Business School at Western University and president and CEO of Lucent Technologies Canada. Georges Soirée is a founding partner at Hugesson Consulting, with executive compensation consulting experience with a wide variety of public and private clients across Canada. Georges also has extensive experience as a board member, including as a member and/or chairman of compensation and audit committees. And Scott Munn, who founded the Calgary office of Hugesson and has been advising boards and executive teams over the past 20 plus years. Scott has been involved in all aspects of executive compensation, performance goal setting, and governance. Welcome to all three of you. Now, today we're going to structure our conversation around 6 themes. First one are issues arising from the pandemic, challenges for companies that have finalized pay decisions, and challenges for companies that have not finalized pay decisions. Then the use of discretion, the issue of pay cuts and deferrals, and then finally, where do we go from here? Now, Georges, maybe I'll start with you. Can you give us a sense of the key executive compensation related issues arising from the pandemic?
Thanks, Rahul. Well, the top of the agenda for all compensation and human resource committees really has been the human capital conundrum, and the degree of pain being seen across companies is actually very wide depending on the sector you're in. When you come back to executive pay and consequences, again, the breadth of issues and the how acute the issues are from company to company is very, very wide. And this has to do with, depending on the sector you're in, also whether or not you do have actually a year end that already has taken place and there are no imminent decisions. But for those companies who do not have a fiscal year end of December 31 and are facing decisions now in the middle of this crisis, essentially, it's raising all kinds of issues. It has to do with how to grant LTIPs or long-term incentives or not. It has to do with pay cuts, either at the executive level or for board members. And essentially also looking at, for example, if you have midterm plans outstanding, performance share units, for example, in flight, what to do with those, again, in the middle of this crisis. So that's a taste of the issues that companies are facing right now.
Great. And Carol, are you able to tell us a little bit about how the board of General Motors has reacted to date?
Sure, Rahul. First thing, though, before I tell you what we did and how we did it, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the context. First of all, most people probably know that General Motors is a large global manufacturing company. We do business in North America, China, South America. We're pretty much out of Europe and Australia. And the reason I mention the global footprint is that we had experience in China with the pandemic reaching China ahead of North America. So we were at a regularly scheduled board meeting on February 25th and 26th in person, and we were talking about the pandemic and primarily about recovery in China, et cetera. And we had a couple of experts as directors who had a lot of medical knowledge. So we were slightly ahead of the curve in talking about this pandemic could be bigger, it could be broader, it could be longer. certainly way more contagious than SARS and other things that we had seen. So we were already thinking about what if scenarios if it hit North America with a vengeance. The other thing that's important to know about manufacturing is that it's a very capital intensive business, and so cash is really important. So we were focusing on talking about ways in which we could preserve cash. And of course, General Motors had the experience with the bankruptcy in 2008 and 2009. So we were acutely aware of the importance of cash when our customers aren't buying anything anymore. So that's a bit of the context, just to give you an idea of some of the things we're talking about. And also paramount was the safety of our employees, because we did understand how contagious the virus this was. And we had seen this in China, the cleaning of the plants and the sorts of things that we had to do in order to reduce the spread of the virus. So context, and that brings me to what did we do and how did we do it. We made a decision that we would, with all the salaried employees, we would defer their salaries by 20%. And we would pay them back a little bit of interest at the end of that, because essentially we were using their money to help fund us through this time. Then on top of that, with the executives, depending on the level, we added a 5% or a 10% cut, not a deferral, in addition to the 20%. So at the very top, it would be 30%. 20% of it was a deferral and 10% would be a cut. And on the cut side, we decided that we would grant some RSUs, which would vest in April of 2021 to somewhat offset the salary cuts that they were taking. Now, having said that, I want to talk about how we did it. We did this in 2 days. So from the time that I'm the chair of the comp committee, that I had a discussion with management, to the time that we pulled together a comp committee and agreed that this would be the path forward, and the entire board, because we had to get board approval because there was an RSU grant. So very fast. And then I think the following day, it was announced to the employees by the CEO. So, I think the lesson in all of that was you do need to act quickly, depending on your circumstances.
Wow, that's quite a story. Now we'll get into a little bit more details here around this, but Scott, maybe over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about the issues arising in companies that have finalized their 2019 pay decisions, as well as 2020 STIP scorecards and the 2020 LTIP grants? And maybe when you touch on that, a little bit about how boards consider the implications of COVID looking at STIP and LTIP.
Certainly. So we should begin by acknowledging that we're talking about many, if not most, of the companies out there that would have had a December 31st fiscal year end and would have, in the normal course, gone through and evaluated performance for 2019, made pay decisions for bonuses in 2019, and also made 2020 long-term incentive grants. And so we also should just maybe park for a moment the fact that we're going to talk later on about changes to level or pullbacks in compensation. This is really around design and performance measures. And overall, what we're hearing and what we're talking to folks about is actually really holding your powder and not making quick decisions, because there's, in most cases, not a lot of information. And many organizations are grappling with what's the future going to look like here. And so we're really seeing folks sort of take their time, if at all possible. How are boards going about doing that? I think it's similar to the case that Carol mentioned. There's a lot of meeting time, there's gathering of information, and there's a fair amount of back and forth between the board and management about what they know and what they don't know, and often an acknowledgement that what they don't know is a lot at this point in time. When it comes to the actual in-place bonuses, it's a great question, because folks would have set their performance measures, set their actual goals for the year, and in a lot of cases would recognize that their business plan's been significantly disrupted. usually to the negative, sometimes to the positive, but start to realize that what they had spent a lot of time building may no longer be accurate or relevant or helpful. And so we're seeing folks taking the time to actually put in place processes to monitor how they're doing over the course of the year and think about, is the differentiation between actual results and budget something that was controllable or not controllable? If it wasn't controllable, how's management doing in terms of mitigating the risk or leveraging an opportunity to the extent that it comes up? And with the long-term incentives, they've been granted. So what they're really focusing on is, what's the real-time value compared to what they thought it was going to be worth? And that's both with respect to the most recent grants as well as the outstanding grants. Now, the long-term incentives have several components. There's restricted shares, performance shares, stock options for the most part. The performance shares can be particularly challenging because in the last few years, boards have moved towards financial and operating measures. And those financial and operating measures might be meaningfully impacted in this environment. And so also trying to think through the implications of those metrics and the retention value, if you will, of those plans is something that's on boards' minds. And at the end of the day, a lot of folks, again, are saying, let's take a wait and see approach and monitor those plans as we go along.
Right. Now, Carol, back to you for a second. Do you see the situations differing among the various boards that you're on? And I might add that the boards that you on are quite different.
For sure I do. And I already described the General Motors situation. Let me contrast that with Maple Leaf Foods, which is in the food industry. They have been deemed an essential service. So our employees there are in plants every day, working around the clock, producing as much as they can. And so what we did in the case of those employees is we actually gave them an increase in pay because they're facing big risks. They're working with each other. They can't work remotely. So a very different situation, and certainly demand is there. Consumer demand has not stopped for food. So we didn't do anything in terms of executive pay because we don't think we need to right now. So a very different situation, which I think is back to that lesson that one size does not fit all. You really have to understand the business, understand what the needs are, and then act appropriately as the comp committee.
Right. George, let's come back to you for a moment. Now, let's take the converse of Scott's answer. And are there any specific issues in companies who have not finalized their 2019 pay decisions or their 2020 grants?
So that bucket of companies and those that, let's say, have a January 31 fiscal year or a March 31 fiscal year, these are the companies that we're seeing are in the eye of the storm because they don't have the luxury of just watching and waiting. They need to actually make decisions amongst the turmoil. So let me talk about it. I'll talk about the bonuses in respect of the year just about to end. I'll talk about how to set the scorecard for the new year and also talk about LTIPs or issuing long-term incentives in a low share price environment. So in terms of the bonuses that might be earned in respect of the year just finished, we're seeing companies deliberate, do we change the quantum from what the formula would otherwise dictate? And for now, we're seeing companies say, well, maybe we don't need to do that. I mean, the year's closed out. All the performance was already there before the crisis hit. But then that begs the question, do you change the timing of when those payments are made, i.e., might you defer them? And if you do defer them, might you change how they're delivered other than cash? Maybe you deliver it in part, some type of equity. So those deliberations are ongoing right now as we speak. And people are just trying to find the right balance of equilibrium. They're looking at factors around how tight is cash, things like that. Then you get into, all right, how do you set a scorecard in this crazy environment? So again, different strokes for different companies, but for those who are hardest hit, it's just not practical. It's not business as usual. You can't set your normal cash flow or return on invested capital or EBITDA goal for the next 12 months because you just don't have line of sight. So companies are realizing, well, we really can't do that with any high degree of confidence. So what should we do? Well, they're doing actually what I think is quite sane. They're saying, well, there are other strategic and operating imperatives that we now have to deal with. How do we do right by our employees? How do we do right by our customers? What are the things that we need to do to handle this crisis? So there are some objective measures that people are saying, well, why don't we track how management's going to do on those, let's say in the first half of the year, and maybe we will be able to go back for the second half of the year and put back some adjusted or updated financial metrics in the normal course that we would typically have, whether it's cash flow or whatever. So that's a flavor for the kind of things going on right now. Then comes the hardest part, how to deal with a normal grant of whether it's an RSU or a PSU or a stock option. Well, first of all, for those companies that were thinking of introducing stock options this year, and there are some, that is pretty much off the table. People are realizing, gee whiz, this is just not the right environment to be issuing stock options. Why? Because it'd be so dilutive. Mm-hmm. And then there's a question of, well, timing. Do we issue the LTIPs now? For those companies where maybe the share price is down 10 to 20%, which in normal times is huge, but in these times is actually not bad, you do some analysis and you may come to the conclusion, well, actually, we can carry on and do what we would normally do. For those who are harder hit, when you do that analysis of looking at the dilution and doing other analysis, you realize, wow, we can't do, it's not business as usual. So again, we might defer. So that's a choice. People are saying, do we just defer when we issue the LTIP? Example, you can go to your employees and say, we will be issuing LTIP, but it won't be until June, or it won't be until September when things settle down. The employees will feel comfortable that there is an LTIP coming, but they will understand also that the details of which have to wait given the uncertainty. The important thing is that boards have to work closely with management teams to do the analysis, and it's really the devil's in the detail. When you look at a low share price, and if you were to issue the normal grant date value that you did, let's say a year ago, $5 million in total of LTIP for a whole pool of people. Well, if you try to issue $5 million of LTIP in RSUs or PSUs today at a very low share price, you're going to end up issuing many more of those units. And the analysis you got to do is say, well, gee whiz, if we do that, and if the stock comes back in 2 and 3 years, back to where it was, or even 3/4 of where it was, whatever, what does that look like? And does that create an unintended windfall? So the advice is do the math, have a look, and you may have to make decisions when it comes time to actually grant the units that'll be a little different because you have one eye on being fair to the employees and another eye, being fair to the shareholders. Lastly, the next big issue when you are issuing, let's say, a performance conditioned share like a PSU, how do you set a 3-year earnings goal or cash flow goal or whatever? Relative goals are easier, arguably, but again, it's pushing out in time for most companies when they will actually be putting the pin in those kind of details.
Mm-hmm. Very difficult questions. So let's go back to something that both yourself and Carol have referred to already, and that's pay cuts and or deferrals. And I'll go to Scott on this one.
Sure.
Scott, can you tell us a little bit about how companies are actually dealing with sharing the burden, if we can call it that, between executives and employees, specifically on how are pay cuts and deferrals being dealt with now?
Yeah, so there's a few examples in the Canadian market of organizations that have already publicly announced that they're going to go down the path of some degree of salary reduction or deferral, or in the case of directors, a change to their retainer. We've tracked at least 11. Some of the examples are Cineplex, CAE, SNC, CNRL, and WestJet, just to give you a flavor of the companies that are out there. In the US, actually, our affiliated firm, Semler Barassi, has a list of over 100 companies on their website if you're interested in taking a look. A lot of airlines, a lot of retailers, whereas here is a bit more of a broad-based group of organizations, and notably some in the energy sector. The cuts tend to be in the 20 to 50% range A fair number where we see them in the 10 to 20% range as well. So it varies. It's obviously based on the business need. And it is absolutely a sharing of the pain between executives and employees and shareholders, right? Because it's usually driven by a business need, as it sounds like it was at General Motors. A couple of other thoughts. There are some companies that are doing it, and maybe it's not as driven by a business need. One of the pension funds announced a deferral of compensation. So that's sort of an example of how they're approaching things. So it's all partly in reflection of the current environment and market that we're working within. So there's a range out there, Rahul.
Right, for sure. So Carol, over to you for a second. You know, these are difficult conversations at the best of times. So this is very tough in this environment, and the news has been generally pretty negative. Do you have any advice for directors on boards on, you know, where to go from here? Are there any silver linings and opportunities?
Well, I'm a natural optimist, so I do have a few silver linings that I can reflect upon so far. One is around strategies of companies, and I'll give you an example. One of the companies that I'm involved in is very much trying to accelerate customer acceptance of its digital platform. Well, in this environment, more and more people are using digital platforms because they don't have an alternative. So one of the things we were talking about is, how do we accelerate that even more when this crisis is behind us, and what lessons are we learning about how to make the experience even better? So I think if you look at the strategies of your companies, one of the things that you can look at is there something in this very unusual environment that has caused a change in either consumer behavior or employee behavior that you might want to carry on with in the future? The second area comes back to board dynamics. And Scott, you reminded me, I forgot to mention when I went through the General Motors pay cuts that the directors also took a 20% pay cut. And I think directors are becoming more collegial, at least in the boards I'm on. I just see that the bonding is increasing amongst ourselves. I think the relationships between directors and management are very, very good. It feels like more of a one team working together. And so I think that's really productive, and certainly something that I think we would want to see carry forward.
Carol, it's interesting. The CEO of Pirelli, I'm not sure if you caught that, but a day or so ago made that was his first response when asked, you know, what's he seeing as this tightening of within the team at Pirelli Global.
Yeah, no, it's true. And then the third one, I'm going to end with a third silver lining, and it's around leadership. And I think we have seen people really rise to the occasion. Some of the executives and non-executives actually rise to the occasion. And we see them, you know, in their normal day where they're executing on their business plans, et cetera. But what I'm seeing are some that are just extraordinary leaders during this time of crisis. And I'll give you some examples. One very senior executive made one-on-one calls to each one of his direct reports. And really the calls were not about the business. They were about, you know, the individual's personal well-being, both physical and mental, but also just to see how are you doing. And after, I think he completed 35 calls, he wrote a letter to them all, sort of summarizing the themes of what he'd heard. But what that showed to me was the empathy that some of these leaders are showing, which as directors, we don't necessarily see when we go to a board meeting. Another example is another CEO. He's been talking about the sorts of leader characteristics that he would like his senior team to follow. And, you know, it's things like stay calm, but also be confident. It's things like, you know, make your decisions based on facts. Don't get caught up in all the, sometimes the trends and the hyperbola. So make sure you're fact-based in your decision-making. Also your presence, and that could be through communication, or it could be like we're doing now through video, or if you still have an essential service working, you know, it might be taking turns to see how they're doing. So presence is important. But all of that to say, I think we're seeing the true character of some of our leaders, and I actually find it quite inspiring. But it also helps us as HR committees and directors when we're thinking about succession planning, because that characteristic, those empathetic skills, whatever you want to call it, the EQ, you really do see those that stand out and make a difference right now.
That's great to hear. We end our conversation on a high point around values and character. What a great place. It's been a very constructive conversation. But before we sign off, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to share any final thoughts from our conversation. And George, maybe I'll start with you, then I'll go to Scott, and Carol, I'll ask you to wrap us up.
Great, thanks, Rahul. Well, look, I think from a board, committee, and senior management point of view, the advice we have here is to, make thoughtful decisions that are based on the available information and some pretty rigorous analysis, and avoid making dramatic changes to programs at this time. You got to let that settle down a bit until things are more well known. So that I would start off with that.
Yeah, I would probably piggyback on that and say, where are you going to apply some judgment? And in a lot of cases, that's going to happen this year. Do your best to put that off towards the end of the year and to have a process in place that gives you the rich information, the accurate information that you need, that's fact-based and not emotion-based, to allow you to apply that informed judgment towards the end of the year. And that'd be my sort of big picture thought, Rahul.
Interesting.
And I guess mine would be a little around the communication theme that I touched on in the silver linings. It's a delicate balance as a board member and an HR committee member between micromanaging what senior management and executives are having to do right now and in very difficult times, but also knowing enough and being supportive enough that you are helpful in helping them come to decisions and, thinking from the perspective of employees and shareholders, et cetera. So I think it's important for directors in particular who have a little more balance in this whole situation, because we're not in the thick of it, to be able to stand back and, to Scott's point, use our judgment and help management without micromanaging them.
Well, great point to end up. Carol, George, Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. And to our viewing audience, thank you for tuning into this webinar. Look out for new installments of this series every week as we navigate this challenge together. Bye for now.